All right, welcome back. So we left off with Jane Addams, looking at statistics in a human socialism way. Brings us to our next topic, environmental determinism. So environmental determinism, if you look at the title, this was a theory of geography that was prevalent in the 1900s to about 1920. And what it states is that your environment determines the outcome of not only your life, but your country's life. So for instance, if you live somewhere in northern Canada or Siberia where it snows all the time, then your culture will inevitably learn how to make houses from snow, like igloos. Your environment determines your future, right? Now, this is a map from a textbook of that time, and the map here is showing climatic energy. The darker the color, the higher the energy. And climatic energy was this idea that if you lived in a climate that was hot and cold, but not too hot, but not too cold, you had this kind of mix, that led to a very robust society because you were never too hot or too cold. Because in some countries here near the equator, where it was very, very hot, it was very hard to be very energetic. It's just, quite honestly, too hot to work that hard. So there was a reason why this happened. If you turn to the next map, this map maps cultural attainment. The highest levels of cultural attainment, they look like they're very similar, and let's go back to the areas with high climatic energy. So, United States, Europe. Look at the culture. Again, United States, Europe. What about the areas right here of low climatic energy? So, Northern Africa, a lot of Asia right through here, very low energy. Let's look at the climatic achievements, or the uh, civilization, again, very low. And, well, to be honest with you, it's very hard to work that hard in the tropics where it's hot all the time. So it's okay that their cultures were more relaxed and weren't the leaders of the world like England and France and the United States were. Hopefully, you found that incredibly racist, because it is. I'm not going to lie. It was part of geography, but geography, like everything else of the time, had racist elements into it. That book was from Samuel Huntington called Climate and Civilization, and he was the proponent of this theory that determined your fate. In other words, in the 1900s, when England and France and Germany and the United States were basically colonizing the entire world and controlling large parts of Asia and Africa, one of their justifications for this was that those areas were not as culturally advanced and that we were actually protecting them. We were going to bring them Christianity. We were going to teach them to be better people because they weren't doing it on their own. And that was called the white man's burden, which is, let's be honest with you, it's a crock of you know what. But they used geography to back them up. Ellen Semple said, well, let's back up a little bit. She said that yes, it is true that it's harder to work in the heat. That doesn't mean that's always the case. Instead of things being determined, geography could be a probable cause. So in other words, determinism says that you have no fate other than what your geography tells you. Semple says that that may be true. So for instance, to go back to our earlier analogy, right? You may live in an environment of snow that would favor you learning how to use snow to build houses like igloos, but not every culture does that. So another example would be that if you live in a country that is surrounded by other countries, it's called being landlocked. If you don't have a port on the sea, then it's very hard to trade with other countries, which means your country would tend to be very poor. But probabilism would say that may be true, but maybe you find another way to overcome that. Maybe instead of making money through trade, you make money through services. We'll talk about that later. That represents kind of an evolution, a leading away from the very racist overtones of determinism to today what we have is kind of a socially sensitive environmentalism. And that is just basically when you look at other countries and other cultures, their location does have an effect. Obviously, if you live in a country that has no snow near the equator, you're really not going to have probably a big part of your culture devoted to making snowballs, right? Acknowledging that, but knowing that people make the choices in the end. So Parenti wrote a book called The Tropic of Chaos. It basically explores this. Tropical countries today have very unique environmental issues that other countries don't face. Increased hurricanes, for instance. Jared Diamond says that when you look at geography and the environment, if cultures do not manage their environment in a way that is sustainable, that they can basically degrade their environment to the point it collapses. If your environment collapses because you've degraded it so much, then it really doesn't allow you to provide for future generations. And there have been several civilizations that have basically crashed and burned, and we think in large part due to environmental decline. The Maya in Mexico are a great example. Up until the year 1400, they were one of the most uh, innovative, flourishing societies on Earth. Huge cities, art, commerce, trade. By the 1500s, they were gone. The Maya are still there, but their cities were empty. And we think they basically degraded their environment so much so they could no longer provide food. So, what we're getting at here is that geography, like chemistry or sociology or criminal justice, any human knowledge is bound up in the society that makes it. And if your society is incredibly racist, as it was, even more so than today in the 1900s, then your knowledge is going to be basically intrinsically tied up in that as well. In other words, as Livingston argues, you cannot compare the geography of today on equal grounds with geography of 1900 because each geography was a part of its time. Okay? So in other words, in past social contexts, if you read Huntington's textbook about geography, the terms that are used casually, left and right, are extremely racist and would never even come close to being published. But today, we are much more conscious of that and how we speak and how we talk, right? And human geography has had its own evolution of that. Geography has also been often used for political goals as well, political aims. Many groups. So, for instance, the Nazis of Germany in the 1940s used geography to explain why they should have the dominant role in Europe. And one of the theories they held, the Mackinder theory, said that whoever controlled the mainland of Europe, the main heartland of Europe, which was Germany and France and Russia, whoever controlled that would dominate the world. And that was one of their goals. And geography was used to basically advance that. Okay. Harvey is a geographer who looked at social geography with a Marxist view, and he says that we have to move beyond that and take into account not only politics but also income. We're going to talk more about Harvey in a few chapters, so just keep that in the back burner for now. But geography in today, right? Where are we now? Contemporary geography. There's been many debates. Since the 1950s, geography's gone through many turns since environmental determinism. And these turns mean that there's just different areas of focus or different methods that are favored. The one thing about geography is it's a very broad subject, so it's never been all encompassing. But in the 1940s, 1950s, as we turned away from environmental determinism, one of the main focuses was the quantitative turn. And what this is, geography to distance itself from the racism that was inherent before, used more numerical data to base their decisions. So stats versus opinions. Predictive models based more on statistics. Statistics were seen to be colorblind, right? I can have a viewpoint of what I think of people who are Hispanic, but statistics will tell you other things, and the numbers are there. So quantitative geography, right? And with this, the flows of connections of geography leads to Tobler's Law. Tobler's Law is probably the only real overarching theme in geography, and that is quite simply that everything is related, just because we live on the same planet. But generally speaking, things that are closer to each other are more related. So I always use this example, right? If you do not live downtown, if you live on the south or west or north side, right? Think about your commute to school. You know the area between your house and the school pretty well, right? You know your neighborhood pretty good. You know your train station if you take the L or the exit on the highway that you drive. But if you go further away from that, you don't know as much, right? So, for instance, I live in the north side of the city and I work downtown, and I know that area pretty well. But if you were to put me 50 miles west in the suburbs, I would need a map. So in other words, the closer things are, The more interaction, the more they're related. Everything is related, but distance is a factor. Now today, we are in what we call the qualitative term. And this starts with the humanist critique. It says that stats are great, they are numeric, they should be colorblind, but some things can't be statistically modeled, right? You can't give a measurement to happiness or anger. Things don't always work out that way. People are not just numbers. There is feeling, there is perception, there is topics that cover more than one subject, right? So this is a cultural geography that doesn't see the world as numbers and maps, but sees these as cultural artifacts. We create the world we live in, right? Let's go back to our analogy about the Chicago, right? There's this general perception that the north side is white, is safe, less crime. The south side is black, is poor, is older. And that's a very much cultural perception because there are areas on either side that don't fit that description, very much so, right? But we create those perceptions by talking about them, right? The feminist critique is very similar in that this one says we need to look at people, but we also need to account for gender. Feminist geography isn't about women in geography, it's about the role of gender, right? And how does that view? And let me just be clear that gender is not the same as sex. And we'll talk about that in details. Sex is biological. Either you are this or that or enter in between. But gender is this idea of what does it mean to be a man, a woman, or intersex, right? Why do in this country women, tend to take care of children more often than men? That's a feminist issue. There's nothing biologically preventing men from working in daycares. But when you go to actually measure the number of men that work in daycares, there are far more women as a percentage that are daycare workers, right? In this country, we have laws that you are supposed to be paid the same for the same work, no matter whether you are a man or a woman. But yet we still see statistically that women make about 2/3 of a dollar for every dollar a man makes. That is a feminist critique of the system, using gender as a role, and geography has that as well. The last one before we take our break is postmodernism. This is the most current term. And what this says is that all of these issues that we're talking about reflect the fact that knowledge is a human creation. And so think about this. Was there a tree of geography where geography apples were hanging and we ate them? Or we found the geography books in the wild? No, geography is the collection of human investigation. We create culture, we create society, we create the language and the viewpoints that we use. All of this is a human creation. If people were gone tomorrow from this planet, then English 101 would be gone too, right? So that being said, if that's the case, you need to acknowledge that because everyone is human and everyone has a bias whether you know it or not. You have to. You have a viewpoint. I can never truly understand what it is to be you perfectly, as well as you can never do the same for me. I have to acknowledge that when I'm doing my research, that I have my own inherent biases. Everyone does. Postmodernism says we can do science, we can investigate, but we have to know that. We have to acknowledge that. And we have to acknowledge that there are other viewpoints that maybe have been marginalized, such as feminism, such as people of different genders or different ethnicities, areas that have never been studied. You can look at areas that have been, had geographic research done on them, and the vast majority of scientific published articles involves areas in Western Europe and the United States. Does that mean that more geographical events happen there? No. But it does mean that the people who publish papers, the people who have gone to school and have, doctorates in these fields tend to be from Europe and America. And you talk about what you know, Tobler's law, things being nearer. It's an inherent bias, and we need to be aware of that. We're going to stop right here because I need to get a cup of coffee. I need to make sure that your minds don't explode from all my really cool rapping, talking. And we'll come back with the last couple slides in just a little bit.